All right. Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Bug Bash. We're excited to have you all join us for another episode of this live series where we tackle real world test automation challenges. And we do that by talking to the folks who face these challenges every single day. I'm your host, Jenna Beckett, and I am very excited to be back here chatting with you all again today. Whether you are joining us live or you're catching the replay, today you are in the right place if you've ever chased down some type of phantom failure or even missed bugs that escaped into production because your test data didn't really match up with reality. Before we get started, I'd like to congratulate another swag winner for the Bug Bash. This time it is going out to Art of Harmony. We will be sending them a little swag package, and you could get one too by attending one of these live sessions or offering up a future topic suggestion in the community discussion thread. And that is actually bringing us into today's episode, which comes to us from a suggestion from an audience member. We're really excited to be presenting to you today When Good Pipelines Go Red. And this is going to be all about test data management. Now, I want to talk to you before we get into the meat of today's episode about some things that are going on in the Cypress ecosystem. So let's take a tour around a couple new features, some community resources, and then we'll get on into test data. So starting off strong with a couple of new Cypress features coming to the Cypress Cloud, we have AI intent summaries. So these are actually already live out in the Cypress Cloud for all tiers of Cypress accounts. And if you've ever had to dig through code or replays to find out exactly what a test is evaluating, then this is a feature made just for you. It allows you to go in, look at a certain test in the Cypress Cloud, and it gives you a really easy to read and understand summary of what the test is trying to capture. You'll find that by going over into any run details, clicking on a particular test, popping open that test details sidebar. You'll see it right there at the top. And speaking of saving time, another new feature that is currently in the process of being rolled out, so this is hot off the presses, is our at-a-glance error summaries. These provide a quick human-readable explanation of when things went wrong and what led up to that failure, so giving you the ability to jump right into debugging. UI coverage, if that's a tool that your team is leveraging, also just got an upgrade that puts control over your UI coverage scores directly back into the test author's hands. You can now configure custom commands and assertions to count towards your overall coverage score. Coming up in Cypress is Cypress 15. So heads up for any of our Cypress Studio fans out there. Cypress 15 is coming this quarter, and it's bringing with it an updated studio experience that you're definitely going to want to try out. So keep an eye out for it. Now, that's what's new in the world of Cypress. Let's go over to what's happening in the Cypress community. And we're going to be talking about some of my favorite community blogs, resources, plugins that have come out recently. So for those attending live, we're going to be dropping these links down in chat. And if you're looking at the replay, just look down at the recording description. So starting off strong with a new plugin from one of our Cypress ambassadors, Mohammed said Ibrahim. This is called Cypress Enterprise Commands. And the plugin offers 80 plus reusable custom commands, which works out of the box on Angular app. If you try it, I have looked through the commands. They look really good. Haven't got a chance to leverage it myself. So if you try it, let us know what you think. And thanks to Mohammed for putting out a really awesome plugin. Another thing coming from the Cypress community that I wanted to highlight is from Cypress Ambassador and one of our Cypress Conf speakers this year, David Ingraham, about a streamlined method for handling multi-user testing. In this article, my favorite approach, or my favorite thing about the approach that David outlines in this article is that it really isn't novel. It just uses environmental variables, API request headers, and session management. So things that you're likely already using in your test suite. And it does that to achieve that real-time multi-user test flow. And that's really the name of the article, Cypress Real-Time Multi-User Testing Made Easy. So go over to Dev2, check it out, and let us know if you implement his approach and how it works for you. So that is what is going on in the world of Cypress and the Cypress community. And now it's time for the topic of today's episode, which I said earlier centers on test data management. And this is an essential piece of reliable automation. But in general, I find that this usually falls to the bottom of the list of factors when you are actually planning out an automation suite. So today we're going to spend some time giving test data the flowers that it deserves by going past just test data generation and into the full life cycle of test data. Joining me for today's discussion is Tsai, technical engineering leader at Cisco. He's also one of our amazing ambassadors on the ambassador crew. So Sam, if you want to come on stage, I really appreciate you being here today. And I would love for you to do a quick intro so we can get to know you.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for the brief intro. I'll share a little bit more about myself. So my name is Tsai. I am a father of 2 young boys. My wife and I serve at a local church, and I'm a software engineer. I've been in the industry for almost 20 years. Did a lot of time in e-commerce. So interesting fact, in Pittsburgh, that's the headquarters of American Eagle Outfitters. Teenage kids clothing company. So that's where I started my career. Did e-commerce there. Jumped around after that. Did some worked at another startup with clothing. Worked at an immigration law firm for a little bit as a software developer, and now I'm here at Cisco, which I've been here for about 5+ years in more of the cybersecurity space. So hope to draw from these experiences as we talk about test data management.
Awesome. Hey, thanks, Sam, for that intro. I think it's time for us to just dive right into the good stuff. So as the session title suggests here, it can test data management can be the culprit behind hard to diagnose errors and bugs. And these can be things that get missed during automated testing. So if test data management is the engine that is powering your automation, then the quality of your test data is the fuel. Using low grade data is kind of akin to putting water in your gas tank, right? It might get you started, but it's really not going to take you far beyond that starting point. So first, we're going to talk about what we mean by data quality and data coverage. And that's, again, something essential for your automation suite. And it's really not only about having data available to you, it's about having the right data. So this means things like avoiding incomplete, stale, or low quality data sets, because those can really lead to things like false positives, missed defects, and of course gaps in your test coverage. So I have a quick example for you. I want you to imagine that your suite only runs the happy path, right? We're going to call this positive data that is in the correct state you need to be able to run your application. And it never really lets those error experiences surface during your automation runs. So you're going to really have no guarantee on predictability of how your app behaves under those fault conditions, unless in your test data you are injecting negative data, maybe boundary values, even nonsensical or invalid data. And trust me, the irony is not lost on me that I am here on my soapbox preaching about test data quality and telling you that you need nonsensical data records. As Alanis Morissette says, Isn't it ironic, right? Uh, all jokes aside, though, these additional layers are essential to truly exercise your app, especially those edge cases that become real world bugs. And in my opinion, test data planning is an important part and likely time consuming part of planning your automation suite. The goal here should really be to systematically cover all of the different data dimensions: positive, negative, boundary, invalid, or nonsensical, and to think of that as not a one-time process. Routine data evaluation is a big piece in what keeps your test suite evergreen. A good practical tip I have here is in terms of collecting like a variety of data dimensions and getting that quality coverage that I'm talking about is evaluating data state as it relates to reported bugs. You could go out, you could do some type of postmortem, even if they're not official in your organization, on a reported bug, evaluate the data state as it relates to that particular defect, and potentially incorporate it into your data set if it's a dimension that could cause trouble in the future. Now, this soapbox that I'm on about having quality and complete test data is something that I think most people can agree on. And it's usually the intention of test suite builders and maintainers. However, the first question that it usually leads to is, where do we get the test data from? And this is where compromises can start being made. So Sam, I'd love to hear your thoughts here on different options for data sources and what your team at Cisco uses.
Yeah, I'm actually going to go back in time a little bit to when I was more in the e-commerce space. So as you were sharing kind of generally about test data, I think in the real world, what you're going to hit is a production issue, right? Your app's going to break. Something's going to go wrong, terribly wrong in production. And I remember at American Eagle, we had this issue of like, it was called the empty bag scenario, where a shopper had a bag, they logged in, boom, it disappeared. Like worst case, as a shopper, as an e-commerce, company trying to sell products. And a lot of the issues we were trying to solve was, how do we reproduce this on our end, right? Because ideally, you'd be able to just be that customer, see their space, get the exact snapshot of the state of the app at the time that it failed. What did they have in the bag? Was it bag related? Was it their session? So just all to say, it's a crucial part to try to, the ideal is just to reproduce the issue, right? We want to break our app down so that we can understand what went wrong. Perhaps it's data related, perhaps it's something else. So given that example, one way you could get test data is production data, right? That is a valid case for testing your application because, that's going to be the most real world example, right? Is the actual data that's going through your system. Of course, there's a little bit of challenges with that, right? We don't want to necessarily, and we'll talk more about this in detail, but we can't necessarily expose, or I can't pull in Art of Harmony's, profile necessarily without them knowing and just log in as them. That would be pretty invasive of their privacy and their rights and things like that. Unless, the privacy policy doesn't exist, which in case we can. But that legal terms aside, I think production data can be really helpful, especially if it's, maybe there's no sort of security risk or no personal information of that data. Like it's just, I don't know, some random, like a database of cats or something. And it's just information and there's nothing necessarily that's, at risk. Then in that case, probably whatever the data source may be, some sort of database, maybe you can copy that database down to lower environments, your staging, testing environments, dev, maybe even local copy of it and things like that. So that's one use case, is to use production data. And then everything after that is the ideal is to try to produce data that represents the real world, right? So, as you mentioned, sort of even nonsensical data, right? What we're trying to do is there are going to be users of your app that, whether intentional or not, they're in this weird case because they have some sort of weird address or weird something, right? Something that's going to cause a potential issue that the development team or the testing team hasn't thought of or covered. Practically at Cisco, I mean, Cisco's a huge company, so my particular space, we deal with eventing. So we're trying to analyze the network traffic data, and we're trying to put it into buckets of what is this event data? Is it malware potential? Is it just a regular event? Is it intrusion, et cetera, et cetera? So we sort of have the feature of classifying our event data. And then for my team, it's all about the analysis feature. So for us to sort of generate data, there's also sort of what I'll call domain specific data, right? So talked about e-commerce where you kind of have more, profiles and, product data. In cybersecurity, we're dealing with network traffic and sort of different types of enriched event details. In which case, well, a couple of strategies that we have at Cisco is in the domain, if you just kind of research network engineers or security, things like that, there's a concept of PCAPs, which are basically packet captures. And so you can sort of use these pre-built data sources that kind of fit the domain that you're working in and sort of replay that traffic on your network and sort of replay potentially what the customer went through. So I think the main thing is knowing your domain will help a lot in terms of determining what is the best strategy for our data. Like whether I'm in e-commerce or in healthcare or just a hobby project, whatever it may be, knowing the domain that you're working in is huge to developing the test data. Let's see some other thoughts, and jump in, Jenna, if there's anything else. But some other things, just random data. So as Jenna mentioned, nowadays it's super easy to find libraries that can just generate fake data, right? And fake data is really helpful. You can even be even smarter to determine, okay, I need fake data for, again, a name or an address or a credit card even. So payment methods are covered. Mm-hmm. Almost anything that you need to test can be generated as fake data. Right. Generally, we're talking about strings, numbers, even generating a fake certificate. If you need to upload a certificate, there's a lot of different things that we can cover in testing, especially if the app is doing it, then our testing app can also do something similar. So those are just some initial thoughts when it comes to test data.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sam, and I especially like your comments around domain-specific data. In previous roles, I've worked in environments where we dealt with HIPAA-related data. So understanding, right, yeah, test data is not just about strings and ints or whatever data type you're looking at. It really is understanding like the content or the context that the data exists within. So for organizations faced by regulations like HIPAA, GDPR, understanding that the data that they use has serious security concerns in any environment, I think is really important and can drive other practices for sourcing data. For example, in those cases, you likely are not going to be able to copy down production data. Yes, you could go through anonymization, but when you're dealing with data warehousing, it's almost more of a cost than it's worth. Right. And like the opposite side of that could be instead you're going to use something inside of your test suite like static fixture files. Is that a time savings? Maybe when it comes to like anonymizing mass quantities of data, but is it going to be a short time? No. Building out static files that you can use inside of your test suite. I mean, I would almost argue that could be someone's entire role, because if you're really treating that data like code, then it has to be maintained. It has to be regulated. It has to be overseen, likely through version control, and it's not an easy undertaking. A couple other ones, like in data sources that came to mind when you were talking, Sam, is, I talked about fixture files. You could also leverage factories. So like code inside of your automation suite that builds data on the fly. Think of something like Tsai.create user. And I've seen that used a lot with some of the libraries like that you were talking about, Sam, like Faker.js, things like that. And then, along with Sam's comment about production data being a valid source in certain domains, same with real server API responses. That is also a valid source in a lot of application instances. So I think that, all of these are really great choices. And when you are thinking about what you're going to use, it really does have to depend not only on your specific application. I think it depends on your team size and your ability to maintain that. And then it also depends on that industry that you're working in. Anything else to add on that, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on API, like that's sort of nowadays that's probably an ideal to use because generally your APIs are going to be what you're getting data from, right? So even if you don't know the backend in full detail, let's say, you know what the app is going to hit if you just monitor, like going. So kind of a general strategy is you're using your app and you're monitoring what is the app doing. Let's say you're just an outsider and you're told to test this app. You don't even need the source code. You can just follow the network traffic, the dev tools open, have your network tab open and see, okay, what are sort of the asynchronous requests or even just the document that it's loading and seeing, okay, so it hits this API, it's this data, and sort of that's your sort of pattern to follow as far as when you're writing your test. You can see, okay, it does like a get on this product / whatever, and it's getting information, or in my case, we do a lot of policies. So it's hitting this policies endpoint and then getting a list of policies. Okay, it's going to use one of those policy IDs. So you're sort of building out the narrative via the app itself and using the network traffic that your app is making client to backend and stuff like that. And then you can generate that same data using those APIs. So skipping auth and all that stuff for now, like you can potentially use the API to start up sort of your in terms of your setup phase. So right, we kind of break down our test into what is it, like setup, exercise, and assert, or whatever word you want to use. And so in your setup phase, you kind of can use those APIs to whether it's to generate a new policy, for example, for my case, we may hit an API. And the idea is, what I like to think about is, I guess as a developer, you're lazy, right? Like, what's the fastest way I can get data? What's the fastest way we can be efficient about this and not have to like hard code anything? I'll like, if it's just, okay, get this policy and then, fill in some details and post it back and get a new policy. And that's where we're going to test. Then let's shortcut that and just build this every single time using this API and things like that. And sort of evolve your testing structure based on whatever the app is doing, and the API is one of those things. And a related tool, which we can, offline, someone could probably research more, is mock service workers. I haven't used it in detail, but it's essentially like it can replace any API and sort of be used all the way from testing, development to, I won't say production, but it's essentially a way for you to call an API, that your app would call an API and return fixture data, whether it's fixture data, whether it's other sources. It's basically sort of like a replacement for the product API, and you can sort of code in what you want to send back. Because again, also API being like an endpoint, that the technology can be anything. It just needs to return data to the browser, to the client. And so that's another sort of strategy is using this sort of this client backend communication.
Yeah, absolutely agreed on that. And we talked a lot about here choosing or having good data and then choosing a good source to pull that data from. But once you progress beyond that, like the next thing that you need to think about is test isolation. And test isolation just means making sure each test starts and ends with a clean slate. So this is something that Cypress tends to focus in on a lot. We call it test isolation. You can find it heavily documented over on our doc site because it is one of the guiding principles that we use not only internally, but as a foundation for building out our best practice recommendations. So let's take a second, I guess, probably to step back and say, what is test isolation? So with test isolation enabled in Cypress, this means that you are going to clear any leftover data, sessions, cookies, or state in the browser before the next test begins. Why do we do this? Well, if we don't, then you could experience something called test bleeding, or one test running into or bleeding over into another. And we find this to be a top cause of flakiness, because if one test relies on the state of another, then are you really testing that specific feature or functionality, or are you testing the workflow that led you up to that state? Because you've got all of this leftover from all the tests that have run previously. And this can become an issue when your team then starts to employ something like parallelization to speed up your test runs, because you don't know for sure that these tests are going to execute in a certain order or even on the same machine. So this definitely has connections into test data, because each test you execute likely impacts the state of your data, especially if you're dealing primarily with end-to-end test. So cleanup is essential here, not only in terms of what is over in the browser, but what is happening over in the database as well. So here's a few things that I've seen in practice for cleaning up test data. Sam, I'd invite you to add in anything that you've seen as well. And first I have here is wrapping test in an isolated transaction, so that any changes that you make could be rolled back. Now, for clarity, I will say that I have seen this employed successfully with unit test and integration test. I don't really feel like it's as useful as a solution in end-to-end test, though. So in terms of end-to-end test, leveraging a before each hook to clean up test data is the most effective approach I have observed. And I did specifically say before each, as that is Cypress's recommended best practice, not using after eaches for data cleanup. And the reason behind that is because if you use, or if you do not use an after each, then you're preserving that hanging state at the end of your test for potential debugging purposes if you need them. So in a before each hook, you could do things like explicitly seeding data. You can remove the test data that was added, or potentially even restore like a baseline DB snapshot, so that each test starts off in a similar clean state. But no matter what method you use, the intention here should all be the same: eliminating an element of unpredictability to ensure that your tests are deterministic. Sam, any thoughts on that subject of test isolation?
Yeah, just to add a few things on the best practices. Yeah, like that's one thing that sort of changed when I started using Cypress, of the key principle of using before hooks instead of the after. Because a lot of us are trained, even developers I interface with today, they're just used to it, right? And I was too. You're kind of used to, you set up your tests, you complete it, and you clean up. And that's not something bad, right? We're not saying this is good or bad, but there are sort of reasons why it could be good to set up and clean up in your before phase versus the after. And part of that, like you said, is for potential debugging. It's double-edged, right? So like in terms of test isolation, we're also then saying, if, for example, a lot of the tests we run in our app, having a policy dangling around could impact a further test. And so one pattern we sort of get around that is sometimes we do things, and it'll evolve, but we'll do things like conditionally in the before hook, we'll say like, if policy exists, use it. If not, create it. Or delete it if it exists and then recreate it. Whatever pattern you want to use. But knowing that if your goal is to be tests isolated from each other, as you build more tests, you kind of have to think that way and almost think like, okay, well, will this policy test affect this neighboring test that I'm writing? And a lot of cases, in my case, yes. And I think kind of a lot of our flaky tests is around that sort of test creep or data creeping between different tests. And we're not always, isolating. Sometimes there's reasons. For example, I think one reason I'll break that mold is if, for example, in our legacy app, there's certain parts of our app, it takes like a minute to create a policy. And that, like, in terms of speed, right? We want our tests to generally be fast, be efficient, because there's a cost to running these, whether that's resource or just time.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some cases, I may follow a pattern of like fail fast, where like, okay, I'll create a policy in one test. And actually my second test will be the one to actually act on that for reasons I mentioned. That could be slowness. And generally, like, I don't want to keep creating a policy every test as a before hook, because again, I don't want to add a minute to each of my tests. So there are some use cases where you may intentionally break out of test isolation, whether it's for speed or whatever it may be. But just know that those are the reasons why you would, and vice versa, to protect sort of the understanding of what could go wrong. It's easier with less variables, less different environmental issues that happen. So
yeah, I think you made a really important point there, Sam, that all of these best practices, and anytime you hear people talking about best practices, they're an ideal state. Is any one application or team going to be able to employ the ideal state 100% of the time? No. But what Sam kind of just walked us through was he said, this is what could go wrong. I've acknowledged that. I'm got this specific case that he probably has documented somewhere of why I'm violating best practices or not going with the ideal state. I think violating is too strong of a word, but not going with like the ideal implementation here. For my own environment, for my own application, for my own specific business needs, need to do this. And I think that's the important part, right? Like understanding what those are. I don't think anyone sets out to not establish a test automation suite using these ideal best practices, but considering it, documenting it, and then understanding how to mitigate the potential issues that could come out of your like modifications for your team. I think that's a big important piece here when you're talking about balancing between the business need and the, like, in terms of technical requirements, the ideal state.
Right.
Go ahead, Sam.
Sorry. I was just going to add like, one of the aspects that we're kind of a theme we're talking about is predictability as well. Mm-hmm. Is when your test data, there's also kind of potentially best practice to have your test data be static in the sense of you always know what your test is going to run, so you have the same expected behavior. And then there's a flip side of that you kind of started the intro with, is nonsensical or sort of more random scenarios. Like, we'll talk a little bit later at Cisco. We have like our own homegrown event simulator, right? I talked about eventing as part of what we do in our teams. A lot of times I've just decided as a team, we're just going to generate random data every single time. And the benefit of that is you kind of expose your app to new scenarios that you may have never hit. Like sometimes we're exposing issues like, oh, why in this case it can't render the IP or whatever it may be, or some contextual issue. Like a lot of our events, each column can have, you can act on an IP address, or you can act on a host name, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you're generating random versions of that, sometimes you expose like, oh, we weren't managing that correctly. We weren't always, we didn't always have the right data validation going on. Because another issue is data validation, right? Like your product may be so complicated you can't possibly validate every possible use case, right? That's almost impossible, right? And so it ends up being in the testing phase where you're sort of putting your app in this, you're validating different types of data, different combinations of data, mm-hmm. which are generally all valid. And one of the challenges we face is sort of some of our event data is fully qualified, just to mm-hmm. say that it could be anything, meaning if it's a string, but it's actually an IP address, like it could just almost be anything and be okay in the database side. And then when we validate it kind of throughout the app, that's when things can just break like crazy. And so just to summarize, like predictability is important, but then sometimes you kind of want to open yourselves up. Maybe you have a separate test suite of just like, this is where we're going to go wild and just let simulation, eventually, generative AI will create these tests and whatnot, but it'll just generate all random possibilities and sort of expose your app to sort of, I guess it's sort of like the automated way of doing guerrilla testing, just like bashing on your app in different ways. But that's another form of using test data to sort of expose bugs or potential issues with your app.
Yeah, for sure. This is the situation where what happens if I have my laptop and I have the application open and I'm skiing downhill and hit the button 50 times?
I swear one of our testers at AE, he was so good, but it was like the most random use case. Like we're like, Ganesh, why do I have to have my like left hand typing sitting on a stool, like blindfolded, and then it hits this issue in the app, and it's like, well, that's what I did. It's like, okay, we'll try and reproduce that.
That's awesome. Now another big piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about is handling sensitive data, and I think we kind of got into this a little bit. But Sam, I'd be interested to hear, kind of in your own workflows, what you all do. Are you dealing with sensitive data? Are you having to do any type of anonymization? What does it look like there?
Yeah, that's a good call. So generally speaking, when we're talking about sensitive data, some terms you may hear is like PII, like personally, it's the second I. It's something about personal information. I forget what the second I is, but personal information. So, I'm Sam Tsai, whatever, like that's my name. Don't want to be sharing my social security everywhere, things like that. And there's also like governing bodies like GDPR with like the European rules and things like that we have to account for with, especially with app services that are being, exposed to public users and things like that. At Cisco, I think we kind of I think of it in terms of two forms. So we have a lot of on-premise testing. So meaning on-premise is essentially that our clients have their own sort of network setup. And so they're setting up the app, not in the cloud. So not your typical go to, Cypress.com and log in, but it's locally managed on their hardware or virtually in a virtual state. And the benefit of that when we're reproducing these sort of, we call them test beds locally, is with on-prem data, if it's just sort of internal to our teams, like it's not that so much that we have to worry about security or PII because it's all sort of just made up and it's kind of sandbox. So if you sort of have a sandbox environment where meaning like you're not really exposing your data externally anywhere, which not always easy to do, right? So you have to be careful with that. There's less concern. But generally the thoughts are like, where is your data going? Where could it be exposed? So, are you CY logging like every detail whenever you hit a bug? Like that may be challenging if you're going to be like CY log user or CY log cart or CY log, event, whatever it may be. So you have to think about where this data is flowing. Where could it be exposed? Are you logging it? We talked about logging to the client, which is the browser in the Cypress test. Are you logging it to some, text file via your server logs? This is also for your production app too. You have to think about like, there's probably good practices in your app itself in terms of security teams focusing on the protection of data. So yeah, thank you. Personally identifiable information. So think through, and here I would also say, if you have the luxury of internal teams like focused on PII or focused on, following rules, this would be a great way to reach out to those teams and ask, hey, what are some practices or what level of anonymization do I need to do to protect the user information? And anonymizing, as you mentioned earlier, is another strategy, is to sort of mask data. So like passwords, making sure that those are masked whenever you log them, or, obviously if you're logging in, it's gonna be somewhere, right? It's gonna be on the wire somewhere. So you can't get away from that. And you're not even trying to get away from that. You're just trying not to, let's say we don't save your auth information as a file in your repo. Like, that's not good practice. And there's a lot of tooling and sort of security tools to help protect you against that. So like if you're in GitHub or whatever, there's certain secrets that it'll even scan your repo to say, hey, this is potentially, PII, or potentially some sort of credentials that you probably don't want committed to your repository. So in terms of strategy, in that case, it's using secrets in GitHub or Jenkins, a vault of some sort, some secure area where you can store that information and pull from that for those that have authorization. Trying to think of anything else. I mean, a lot of it's just, like I said in the beginning, thinking through where could this data be exposed. If your app is simpler and you don't have to worry about that, that's great. There's less concern. So yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'm sure some people that have to deal with it on a daily have to think about it, like a healthcare, service or something like that, or even in commerce, you have to protect the data of the customer and things like that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one thing that this brings to mind for me, you mentioned masking, and I would encourage folks, probably not something we're going to dive deep into now, but to go out and kind of look up the difference between, for instance, static masking, something that's probably good when you're in lower environments, especially if like Sam mentioned, you're governed by GDPR, you're governed by HIPAA. Any data that you use is likely going to involve PII. So that is really great. Again, it's kind of a replaces sensitive data in like a at-rest state. Dynamic masking, and there's a lot of tools that you can use for this. In fact, I see this as a really great opportunity for AI in test automation. This really involves kind of like going out and in real time asking for data and then intercepting those queries and on the fly doing some type of masking of PII. So go check out those concepts. Right now, we're going to go on and talk about tooling in terms of test data management. And Sam, I'd love to hear from you if there are tools that you all use at Cisco that help make generating data or governing test data a little easier for your team.
Yeah, for sure. And we kind of touched on it earlier. And again, this is a little bit more domain specific and even more like team specific, right? So hopefully within each of your own feature teams or whatever use case you have, like one of the advice I was going to give is leverage your feature team, right? Like someone needs to have data at some point when you're creating a feature. They're probably thinking about, how do I generate this data? Because you're not always just going to get it out of the air. Like you kind of have to think through, where's this going to come from? What are the potential? I mean, your whole app is built on data. That's kind of what we do all the time. So for us, like I mentioned, we have an event simulator. So, someone wrote a tool for us to be able to generate events, and we feed a config. So a lot of it's like templatized, meaning we'll feed it, okay, here are the possible IP ranges we want to generate for this event. And we want to generate different event types. Some are malware, some are connection. And again, this is domain specific, but hopefully it translates to what could potentially be for your use case. And so we kind of put the things that we do store is maybe the config in our repository for a given test. So we'll say, okay, this test is testing specifically just connection events. And so we'll feed the config, like, here are the minimal set of fields that we need to generate, or the maximum, whatever is useful for that test. And try to, generally, you're either feeding it like static data, like here are some potentially URLs I want to create. Obviously, I could also create random URLs if we wanted to, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, I give it a set of 50 URLs, and that's sort of stored in the config file itself. all the way down to different countries, source country, destination country, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you think about it, you're sort of building out a mini database of sorts of what's the field type, what's the data we're trying to generate, what are your potential ranges or min and max if it's like a number or things like that. So for our testing, a lot of my team is doing is just the config side of it. And we're leveraging a tool that exists. We'll use Cypress even to sort of run the tool. So it actually runs on the app in the server. So a lot of our tests will do SSH commands to sort of set up the connection, run, whether it's written in Python or whatever language the tool is written in, we'll run that as a task in Cypress, get the results or get some sort of validation that it ran, and then we'll run our tests. And a lot of kind of what I'm sharing today is focused on end-to-end. When it gets lower, like unit testing or integration testing, you may not need all of that heavy lifting in terms of event simulation. You may just be doing one component that's doing one aspect of the event type or something like that. And so your data set's a lot smaller. And in that case, you can either, like Jenna and I mentioned, use your API. You could have a fixture in that case, maybe. You can maybe even at times just hard code a value. These aren't necessarily bad practices, but you got to think about maintenance, predictability, efficiency. Like, how is that going to evolve with the app? Like, one of the interesting things at Cisco is when I first joined, we have these test cases written out. And it's really great that we have like test cases written out, right? You basically have a set of instructions telling you what to do to test the app. But they're written, they could be, like 20-year-old test cases. And so you have to sort of sift through like, all right, steps 1 through 5, just ignore it. It just doesn't even make sense. But at least I have like a reference point of what are the different aspects of the app I need to test. And sort of it's not necessarily directly to your question, but the tooling and all this stuff, one of the side benefits I found is you get to learn more about your app. You get to learn more about sort of the features that you're doing, even the domain. Like, I'm not a network engineer. I'm not a security engineer, but being in this space, I'm not even a quote unquote testing engineer, but being in this space, you get to learn through these things like, oh, okay, this is how this aspect works. This is what eventing means in this case. And so tooling's there to kind of make it easier. So all about developer experience. So we can talk DX all day if we want to. That's my jam if you want to. But using tools to help generate the data, whether that's homegrown library to call your APIs. So you have things at your disposal, but something has to call an API. Something has to give a set of instructions to some backend to get data back or whatever it may be. And so other sort of open source opportunities, we mentioned Faker.js. I kind of checked on it recently because I used it like 20 years ago, so it was much different then, very limited use cases, but now it's got like domains for all kinds of things. So it's pretty cool. And the idea there is basically you can use a third-party library to, whether it's seed your database or seed just that test that you're focused on. Again, the more you know your domain, the easier it is to use that tool. So if I'm dealing with customer information, I generate a fake, user profile, a fake shipping address, a fake billing address, things like that. Let's see what else. And another sort of general approach that I found is don't fear like spending a lot of time running a test, because your first go at it may take a week, 2 weeks, a whole sprint if you're doing sprints. But as you sort of break it down, you're seeing patterns. Okay, I've done this before, or this could be easier. I could abstract this out to its own library or whatever. Like, you don't have to solve it all on day one, but as you start to write your tests out and you're dealing with the different data, you see, okay, here's a pattern that I can pull this data out. And maybe it's, like in our case, a lot of our Cypress tests went from like really long Cypress tests to, look shorter because now we're using a lot of helpers and we're using a lot of, whether it's a custom command or just a straight up, library that we're creating in the Cypress repo, or we created sort of now our own NPM module that kind of helps deal with repeatable automation tasks that we need to do. Maybe one day we'll open source that, because there's nothing in that library itself that's so specific to Cisco. But obviously, we're doing things that are focused on Cisco and things like that. But the goal there is basically use the tool, like the tool that can come as you go, and it'll evolve. We may swap out Faker with some other library. We may continue to use our proprietary event simulator. There may be other open source library opportunities, like, again, domain specific. So like network traffic, right? There's a lot of network engineers out there, a lot of security engineers out there. They're doing this. There's probably some tool out there that I can leverage to adopt in my particular test. Not going to get too into it yet, but like, obviously with the boom of AI, like maybe you could just ask AI to generate some test data. Obviously, the better the context that it has, the better the data is going to be. But I'm not going to get into the ethics of AI yet, but like it's there. It's going to be here, and it's not going anywhere. So that's another opportunity, if we want to call it that, to sort of generate data and potentially be part of the workflow of your testing. I'm trying to think what else. Sometimes we like for tooling in our app, sometimes we're being very low level, meaning I'll SSH into what we call our firewall management center, and I'll run like a CLI command before I run the actual test, or as part of my before steps, right? So in Cypress, I have no fear of just like going into the box and doing some root commands just to get a certain state. Why? Well, that's generally faster than dealing with even an API. Like sometimes the API has too much business logic that can slow down the test. I'm not testing the API there. I'm testing the actual feature. And so that's another kind of thinking is like, what are we actually testing? Are we testing the API? Are we testing that I can create something? Or are we just dealing with using it and modifying it? And so think in those terms of how can you shortcut just to get to your exercise phase, and then you can assert and stuff like that. So I could ramble on and on about this, but I think generally there's a lot of tooling available for all kinds of domains. There's homegrown tools that maybe exist in your company or your own pet project. Maybe you can build your own tools and possibly create plugins as people shared at the beginning. There's commands and things like that you can do. So there's a lot of opportunity. If you have a specific question, feel free to ask that and we can talk through that.
Sam, you mentioned a couple gems in your comments there. First, I will talk DX any day, so don't be surprised when I take you up on that. The other thing you mentioned that it's almost kind of revolutionary. Like you said, don't be afraid to take time in writing a test. Like I feel there's so much out there in test automation right now about, especially with AI, about expediting test authorship. And, I think a lot of that boils down to like getting the boilerplate out of the way so that you can handle like the more like interesting discoveries that you mentioned of, like finding out more about the domain you're working in, more about the app you're working in. And by finding those things out, creating smarter tests, smarter test suites. But I think, saying that, don't be afraid, especially on a first pass, to take a while to write that test. I think that is a really good call out. We are reaching the end of our bug bash time. So I'd like to leave you all with some, best pieces of advice around test data management. So I'm going to start with mine, and then Sam, I'm going to pass it over to you. So sure. My best piece of advice in terms of test data management is to treat your test data as code. This means storing it in version control. So every change is tracked, reviewed, and is audible. By extension, that also means that changes to test data should be included in PRs and have code reviews. Again, is that time consuming? Yes. Is it worth it? In my opinion, also yes. And finally, if possible, automate the provisioning of data in your CI/CD pipeline. So the exact version of the test data that needs to be ran, that's being leveraged, and it's being done without any manual intervention. That is my nugget of knowledge. So Sam, I'm going to pass it over to you. What's your best piece of advice for test data management?
Yeah. Best piece, I guess what I think about is, as I mentioned, leverage your feature teams. Now, if you have a feature team, if you're a team of one, leverage yourself to the max capacity. But the idea there is leverage your feature teams because, whether you're a developer or a tester or whatever part you play in your team, you know, as a community, you're solving a problem, and data is one aspect of it. You'll know the best, the why, the how, the what, as you talk to your team about it. And other things, what I'm trying to say is, leverage prior art. So like, I hate to say this, but also sometimes documentation. So if you have a public company or a public service, there's probably documentation, a help section. Sometimes that actually can inform you as a tester or a developer of what type of data can I interface with. So
Yeah.
It's leveraging kind of prior art that exists, your teams, some of the tribal knowledge that's in your team, documentation, whether that's public or private, test cases, as I mentioned, if there's like written test cases that'll inform sort of what your data should look like, what are the possible things. So that's kind of my best practices, I would say. And yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, it has. Sam, I really appreciate the conversation and the insights that you've provided. I'm sure we have some questions, so I'm going to go ahead and pop open the Q&A. For those of us joining live, we'd love to hear your questions on test data management. I know there is a ton of things about Cypress that we could talk about, but let's keep it focused in on our discussion at hand. There's a couple other places you can navigate to for like Cypress implementation questions. You can go over to the need help thread in the Discord server. Roadmap questions, those can kind of go over to the general community chat section. But for now, if you have any of those test data management questions, go ahead and drop them in chat. And while you are dropping those in chat, Sam, I'm going to ask you a question that if anyone's seen an episode of this live stream before, they know what's coming. I love to hear from all of our guests. What do you think is the most underutilized Cypress command?
Oh, underutilized. Okay. I will say, well, underutilized in the sense, I think not everyone knows how Cypress works, meaning the whole ecosystem. So your plugins. So how does the plugins aspect work? I think a lot of issues get hit because you forget, okay, your plugin setup is your node environment. That's where you can set up different tasks, your before like hooks in terms of the whole test running. I do a lot of sort of what we call bootstrapping in the plugins aspect of setting up things globally for a whole test bed, like whether that's registering some sort of licensing or things I don't want to ever do again. So plugins, knowing your ecosystem there. And then the client side where your test is actually run, that's where you have the available things like Cypress commands, custom commands, and sort of knowing the two differences, because sometimes you run into issue like, why can't I run this node thing in my browser? Well, you can't do it directly unless you use something like CY task or CY exec or whatever it is. And so I think having a knowledge of the Cypress ecosystem only makes you a better engineer or whatever you want to call it to do your tests. So that's my secret sauce, if you will.
I dig that. I'm looking in chat. I don't see any questions. Maybe a couple comments about implementations that different teams use for their test data management. So I'm going to go ahead and say thanks again, Sam, for joining us for the episode. Before we head off, folks, I'm going to do a quick recap of what we covered in our session today. So here are the things that I think should be big takeaways. So first of all, test data is the fuel for your automation suite. Make sure it's high quality and provides coverage across different data dimensions. There are a ton of options when it comes to sourcing test data, so make sure you consider them all and then find the one that achieves a good balance between like an ideal state and your specific business needs. And doing so and with the goal of getting realistic data in place so that you're setting your suite up to be as evergreen as possible. Another thing we talked about was making sure your tests run in isolation. That's not just a browser issue, that's a data issue as well. So making sure you take those cleanup actions after tests are executed. We also talked about no matter what environment you're in, you need to be aware of any sensitive data that you're dealing with and be aware of the regulations that your specific organization is ruled by, any governing bodies like GDPR, HIPAA that are going to impact how you use data inside of your different environments. Sam gave us some really great insights on different tooling. I learned that he's really interested in DX, so I'm going to bug him about that later. But some of the things he mentioned were, things like using backups and snapshots, leveraging libraries like Faker.js. All of these things, homegrown tooling, are things that can be leveraged to make dealing with test data and maintenance of it just a little easier. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you all at the next Bug Bash, which is coming to you on July 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern. Remember, we're flipping back and forth between morning and afternoon, letting everybody get a chance to join us live. And if you would like to have a certain topic addressed, like the one that was addressed today, go over to the thread in Discord and drop us a topic suggestion. We'd love to hear what you want to talk about, and maybe we can cover it in a future episode. Until then, though, folks, happy testing, and we'll see you next time.